They say blood is thicker than water, but my own brothers proved that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most can hurt you the deepest. For 2 years I lived in shame and silence, believing I was nothing more than a burden to my family. I was wrong about so many things, but most of all I was wrong about my own worth. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Margaret Johnson, but everyone has always called me Maggie. I'm 72 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I knew what family meant. I spent 35 years teaching elementary school children, watching them grow and learn, celebrating their victories and comforting them through their struggles. When I retired, I felt blessed to have had such a meaningful career. My husband Frank and I had a good marriage. 43 years together, through thick and thin. We never had children of our own, but we poured our love into our students, our nieces and nephews, and each other. Frank was my anchor, my best friend, and my biggest supporter. When he passed 8 years ago from a heart attack, I thought my world had ended. But I'm stronger than I gave myself credit for. I learned to live alone in our little 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. I kept up with the garden Frank had loved so much, maintained my friendships at church, and even volunteered at the local library reading to children. My arthritis bothered me some mornings, and I had to be careful about my diabetes, but I was managing just fine. I have 2 younger brothers, Robert and Thomas. We call Robert Bob. He's 68 and owns a small construction business. Thomas is 65 and works as a manager at the local hardware store. Growing up, we were close, but life has a way of pulling families in different directions. After Frank died, they'd check on me from time to time, usually calling on holidays or stopping by maybe once every few months. The day that changed everything started like any other Tuesday morning in March. I was watering my African violets on the kitchen windowsill when I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It sounded like water dripping, and I was worried we might have a pipe problem. Frank had always handled these things, but I'd learned to be more independent over the years. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully made my way down the basement steps. I'd been down there dozens of times since Frank passed, organizing his tools and storing seasonal decorations. The steps were wooden and a little steep, but I'd never had trouble with them before. That morning was different. As I reached the bottom step, my slipper caught on something, maybe a loose board, maybe just my own clumsiness. Before I knew what was happening, I was falling forward, my hands reaching out to break my fall. I landed hard on the concrete floor, and immediately felt a sharp pain shoot through my right ankle. I lay there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The pain was intense, and I couldn't put any weight on my foot. Worse than the physical pain, though, was the fear. I was alone, and I was hurt. What if I couldn't get back upstairs? What if this was the beginning of the end of my independence? Eventually, I managed to crawl to the bottom of the stairs and call out for help, hoping one of my neighbors might hear me. Mrs. Patterson next door has good hearing for her age. After about 20 minutes of calling, she heard me and came over with her spare key.
"Oh my goodness, Maggie!"
she exclaimed when she found me. "What happened, honey?" A Mrs. Patterson called 911, and soon I found myself in the emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital. The X-rays showed that my ankle wasn't broken, just severely sprained, but the doctor said I'd need to stay off it for at least 2 weeks and use crutches for a month after that. "Do you have family who can help you?" the young doctor asked, looking at his clipboard. "Yes," I said, though something in my chest felt heavy. "I have 2 brothers." That's when I made the call that I would come to regret. I phoned Bob first. "Maggie, what's wrong?" His voice sounded impatient, like I was interrupting something important. "I had a little fall in the basement. I'm at the hospital, but I'm okay. Just sprained my ankle. They say I'll need some help for a few weeks." There was a long pause. "Jesus, Maggie. This is exactly what we were worried about." "What do you mean? You living alone in that house? It's not safe anymore. You're not getting any younger, and now this happens. We need to talk." Within an hour, both Bob and Thomas were at the hospital. They didn't come alone. Bob brought his wife Linda, and Thomas brought a folder full of papers. "We've been discussing this," Bob said, barely looking at me as he spoke. "Even before this accident, you can't keep living alone, Maggie. It's not practical anymore." "But I've been doing fine," I protested. "This was just one little accident." Thomas, who had always been quieter than Bob, finally spoke up. "Maggie, we love you, but we have to be realistic. You're getting older, you have health issues, and now you're hurt. What happens next time? What if you fall and break a hip? What if your blood sugar drops and no one's there?" "We've looked into some options," Linda added, pulling papers from Thomas's folder. "There are some nice assisted living places nearby, And we've talked to a financial advisor about your situation. My situation. I felt confused and overwhelmed. The pain medication was making me groggy, and I was having trouble following their conversation. Maggie, honey, Bob said, his voice taking on that tone people use when they're talking to children, you don't have a lot of money. Frank's pension ended when he died, and you're living on just Social Security. These care facilities are expensive. We're going to have to make some difficult decisions. I wanted to protest, to tell them I was fine, that I could take care of myself. But lying there in that hospital bed, my ankle throbbing and my head fuzzy from medication, I felt so small and helpless. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was fooling myself thinking I could manage alone. We just want what's best for you, Thomas said, patting my hand. We're family. We'll figure this out together. That word family should have comforted me. Instead, something about the way they were talking made me feel like I was drowning. They spoke about me like I wasn't even there, making plans for my life without asking what I wanted. But I was scared and hurt and alone, and they were my brothers. They were all I had left. So I nodded and said, okay, whatever you think is best. I had no idea I had just signed away my freedom. Recovery from my sprained ankle should have taken a few weeks. Instead, it became the beginning of 2 years of feeling like a stranger in my own life. Bob and Thomas didn't waste any time. The day I came home from the hospital, they were already there with a plan. They'd moved my bedroom downstairs to Frank's old den, claiming the stairs were too dangerous for me now. We're just being practical, Bob said as he and Thomas carried my dresser downstairs. You don't need to be going up and down those stairs on crutches. I watched them rearrange my life from my spot on the living room couch, my ankle propped up on pillows. The den had been Frank's special place, filled with his books, his reading chair, his fishing magazines. Now they were boxing up his things like they were nothing more than clutter. Where are you putting Frank's books? I asked. In the garage for now, Linda replied, not looking up from the box she was packing. We'll sort through them later. You don't need all this stuff cluttering up your space. I wanted to tell her that those weren't just stuff, they were memories. Frank had read every one of those books, sometimes reading passages aloud to me in the evenings. But I didn't say anything. I told myself they were helping, that I should be grateful. Thomas returned from the garage and sat down across from me. Maggie, we need to talk about finances. Bob's been looking at your bills and bank statements. My bank statements? I felt a flutter of alarm. How did you get those? You gave us permission to help you, Bob said, emerging from the den with another box. Remember, at the hospital, we can't help if we don't know what we're dealing with. I didn't remember giving them permission to go through my private papers, but the days after the accident were still fuzzy. Maybe I had agreed to something without really understanding what it meant. Bob sat down with a folder in his hands. Maggie, your financial situation is worse than we thought. Your Social Security barely covers your basic expenses, and this house is eating up money in maintenance and utilities. The property taxes alone are killing you. But I've been managing fine, I said weakly. You've been dipping into your small savings account every month, Thomas added. At this rate, you'll be completely broke within 2 years. Bob opened the folder and showed me papers covered in numbers I couldn't quite focus on. We think the best solution is to sell the house. Use the money to pay for a nice assisted living place. It'll be safer, more social for you, and financially responsible. Sell the house. My heart felt like it stopped. But this is my home. Frank and I lived here for 30 years. Maggie, be realistic, Linda said, her voice sharp with impatience. You can't maintain this place anymore. Look around, the gutters need cleaning, the fence is falling down, and who knows what other problems are lurking. What happens when the roof needs replacing? Or the furnace dies? I have neighbors who help with. You can't rely on neighbors forever, Bob interrupted. What you need is professional care. We found a lovely place called Sunset Manor. It's clean, safe, and they have activities. You'll make friends. I'd heard of Sunset Manor. It was one of those big institutional buildings on the edge of town. Nothing like a home. Nothing like my home. I don't want to live in a nursing home, I said, surprising myself with how firm my voice sounded. It's not a nursing home, Thomas said quickly. It's assisted living. Very different. You'd have your own small apartment. A studio apartment, Bob corrected. But you don't need much space at your age anyway. Over the following weeks, as my ankle slowly healed, my brothers became constant fixtures in my life. They came by every few days, always with more papers to sign, more decisions that needed to be made, for my own good. They took over paying my bills, claiming it was too complicated for me to manage with my injured ankle. They scheduled my doctor appointments and insisted on coming with me, speaking for me like I couldn't answer questions myself. Mrs. Johnson is having some trouble managing on her own, Bob would tell the doctors while I sat right there. We're concerned about her safety living alone. The doctors, busy and distracted, would nod and make notes in my file. I tried to speak up once to say that I was doing fine, but Bob quickly jumped in. She's being modest. She had a bad fall just last month. We found her on the basement floor. The way he said it made it sound so much worse than it was. Like I was frail and confused instead of someone who'd simply caught her slipper on a step. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after my accident, Bob arrived with a real estate agent. "Maggie, this is Janet Morrison. She's going to take a look at the house and give us an idea of what it might sell for." I never agreed to sell, I said, but my voice sounded small even to my own ears. "We're just getting information," Bob said smoothly. "No harm in knowing what our options are." I watched Janet Morrison walk through my home, taking notes and photos, talking about updating and staging, like she was discussing a piece of merchandise instead of the place where I'd loved and grieved and lived for 3 decades. That evening, after they'd all left, I sat alone in Frank's den, now my bedroom, surrounded by boxes of his belongings and feeling like a stranger in my own house. I kept telling myself that my brothers meant well, that they were just trying to help. But something deep in my chest felt wrong, like I was losing myself piece by piece. I picked up the phone to call my friend Dorothy from church, thinking maybe I could talk through my feelings with someone. But then I remembered Bob had said something about my phone bill being too high, about needing to cut unnecessary expenses. What if they considered my friendship calls unnecessary? I put the phone down without dialing. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of Frank's den, feeling more alone than I'd felt even in those first dark months after he died. At least then, I'd still felt like myself. Now, I felt like I was disappearing, and the scariest part was that I was letting it happen. I had no idea that things were about to get much worse. The real estate agent called the next morning with an offer on the house. Bob and Thomas arrived within the hour, papers in hand and minds already made up. "It's a good offer, Maggie," Bob said, spreading the contracts across my kitchen table. "Better than we expected for a house this age." "I'm not ready to sell," I said, but even I could hear the weakness in my own voice. "When will you be ready?" Thomas asked. "When you fall down the stairs and break your neck. When you can't afford to heat the house next winter." They had an answer for every concern I raised. They'd already visited Sunset Manor and put down a deposit, just to hold a spot. They'd calculated exactly how much the house sale would provide for my care. They'd thought of everything except what I actually wanted. "We're trying to help you, Maggie," Bob said, his voice getting that edge it had when he was losing patience. "But we can't force you to accept help. If you want to stay here and struggle, if you want to be a burden on everyone around you, that's your choice." A burden. The word hit me like a physical blow. Is that what I was? Is that how my own brothers saw me? "I don't want to be a burden," I whispered. "Then let us help you," Thomas said gently. "Let us take care of the details so you don't have to worry about them." Looking back now, I can see how they manipulated me, how they used my fear and my guilt to make me compliant. But at the time, sitting at that kitchen table with those contracts in front of me, I felt so tired and confused and small. I signed the papers to sell my house. Bob smiled and patted my shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Maggie. You'll see, this is going to be so much better for everyone." As I watched him gather up the signed contracts, I realized he was right about one thing. This was going to be better for everyone. Everyone except me. Moving day arrived faster than I expected. Bob and Thomas hired movers to pack up what they deemed essential from my house. Everything else, Frank's books, our wedding china, photo albums, my garden tools, was either donated or thrown away without asking me. "You don't have room for all this stuff," Linda kept saying as she directed the movers. "Besides, you need to start fresh." I wanted to ask why starting fresh meant throwing away 43 years of memories, but I'd learned to keep my questions to myself. Every time I spoke up, Bob would get that look on his face like I was being difficult, unreasonable, ungrateful. Sunset Manor was exactly what I'd expected and feared. A long, low building painted institutional beige, surrounded by a parking lot instead of gardens. The lobby tried to look cheerful with silk flowers and motivational posters, but it smelled like disinfectant and sadness. "Isn't this nice?" Thomas said as we walked down the narrow hallway to what would be my new home. "Look how clean everything is." My apartment was a single room with a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and one window that looked out onto the parking lot. After 30 years in a real house with a real kitchen and a garden and rooms full of memories, this felt like a prison cell. "It's cozy," Bob declared, setting down the one box of personal items they'd allowed me to keep. "Everything you need is right here." What I needed was my home, my independence, and my dignity. But those weren't things that fit in a studio apartment at Sunset Manor. The first few weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up every morning forgetting where I was, reaching for the bedside lamp that had been on Frank's side of our bed for decades. Instead, I'd find the institutional nightstand with its built-in call button, a constant reminder that I was now someone who might need emergency help. The other residents were friendly enough, but most of them were much sicker than I was. During meals in the dining hall, I'd sit with women who couldn't remember their own names or men who told the same stories over and over. I began to understand that Sunset Manor wasn't really assisted living, it was the place families put their elderly relatives when they didn't want to deal with them anymore. Bob and Thomas visited every Sunday, bringing me small gifts like magazines or candy, acting like devoted brothers. But their visits felt more like inspections than family time. "How are you settling in?" Bob would ask, looking around my room like he was checking to make sure I hadn't somehow acquired more possessions than I was allowed. "Are you taking your medications properly?" Thomas would add, examining the pill organizer the staff had given me. They never asked if I was happy. They never asked if I missed my home or my garden or my independence. They asked practical questions and seemed satisfied with practical answers. About 3 months after I moved in, Bob sat me down with another folder full of papers. "Maggie, we need to talk about your ongoing expenses. The cost of this place is higher than we originally calculated." My heart sank. "Am I running out of money already?" "Not exactly, but we need to be more careful. We've found some ways to economize." Economies. They'd found meant cutting off my landline phones. "You can use the phone at the nurse's station if you need to make calls." Canceling my subscription to the local newspapers. There are newspapers in the lobby. And reducing my personal spending money to $20 a week. $20? I couldn't hide my shock. Or what if I need new clothes, or want to get my hair done, or the dining hall provides all your meals. Thomas interrupted, and there's a beauty shop right here in the building. Very reasonable prices, but $20 a week. I trailed off doing the math. That was less than $3 a day for anything I might want or need beyond basic survival. "Maggie, you have to understand," Bob said, his voice taking on that patient tone again. "We're managing your money responsibly. Would you rather spend it all quickly and then have nothing? This way, your funds will last much longer." I wanted to ask exactly how much money I had, where it was, how they were investing it. But every time I'd tried to ask financial questions in the past, they'd overwhelmed me with complicated explanations and made me feel stupid for not understanding. "We're handling everything," Bob always said. "You don't need to worry about the details." But I was worrying. I was worrying about a lot of things. I was worrying about why I couldn't afford a simple phone line when the house had sold for such a good price. I was worrying about why my brothers always seemed to know exactly how much money I had but never showed me bank statements or investment reports. I was worrying about why I felt poorer now than I had when I was living alone on just my Social Security. Most of all, I was worrying about what had happened to the woman I used to be. The Maggie who had managed a household, balanced a checkbook, made her own decisions, and lived independently for 8 years after Frank died. Where had she gone? The activities director at Sunset Manor, a cheerful young woman named Karen, tried to get me involved in the social programs. There was bingo on Mondays, crafts on Wednesdays, and movie afternoons on Fridays. I went to a few sessions, but my heart wasn't in it. "You seem sad, Mrs. Johnson," Karen said to me one afternoon after a particularly depressing craft session where we'd made tissue paper flowers. "Are you adjusting okay?" I wanted to tell her that I wasn't adjusting at all, that I felt like I was slowly disappearing, that I missed my real life so much it hurt. Instead, I said, "I'm fine, just tired. Have you talked to your family about how you're feeling?" I almost laughed. My family was the reason I was feeling this way. But how do you explain that your own brothers have made you feel like a burden, like someone whose opinions and desires don't matter? "My brothers are very busy," I said instead. That was true. Bob was always talking about work problems and construction deadlines. Thomas mentioned stress at the hardware store and his wife's health issues. They had full lives, important responsibilities, real problems to deal with. And then there was me, their elderly sister who'd fallen down some stairs and needed to be managed like a problem to be solved. The months blended together in a haze of routine. Breakfast at 8, activities at 10, lunch at noon, more activities at 2, dinner at 5, lights out by 9. It was like being back in elementary school, except I was the student instead of the teacher. I tried to maintain some dignity, some sense of self. I kept my small space neat and organized. I read the books in the lobby library, even though most of them were romance novels or mysteries I'd read years ago. I wrote letters to old friends, though with no phone and limited money, it was hard to maintain those relationships. One afternoon, about 8 months after moving to Sunset Manor, I was sitting in the lobby when I overheard 2 staff members talking. "Poor Mrs. Johnson in 47, one of them said. "Her family never calls, hardly ever visits. Just drops her off here and forgets about her. At least she's one of the easy ones," the other replied. Never complains, always pleasant. Some of these families dump their relatives here and then act like they're doing them a favor. I realized they were talking about me. I was Johnson and 47, the woman whose family had dumped her and forgotten about her. The woman who never complained because she'd been trained not to. That night, lying in my narrow bed, and listening to the sounds of the building settling around me, I tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly happy. It had been in my garden, I thought. The spring before my accident, I'd planted new rose bushes and spent hours tending them, watching them bloom. I wondered who was taking care of my roses now. Probably no one. Probably they'd been torn out to make the house more appealing to buyers, replaced with something low, maintenance and generic. Like me, they'd been discarded when they became inconvenient. But unlike my roses, I was still alive. Somewhere deep inside the compliant, quiet woman I'd become, the real Maggie was still there. She was angry and hurt and tired of being treated like she didn't matter. I just didn't know how to find her again. Change came to my life in the form of Sarah Chen, though I didn't recognize it as change at first. After I'd been at Sunset Manor for about 10 months, I developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. The facility's nurse practitioner was concerned enough to recommend that I have someone check on me a few times a week, just to monitor my breathing and make sure I was taking my medications properly. Bob wasn't happy about the additional expense. "She's fine," he told the administrator during one of their meetings that I wasn't invited to attend, even though they were discussing my health. "This is just another way for you people to squeeze more money out of families." But the nurse practitioner insisted, and eventually Bob agreed to the home health visits, probably because he realized it was cheaper than having me end up in the hospital. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday morning in early February. I was expecting someone older, more clinical, like most of the staff at Sunset Manor. Instead, I opened my door to find a petite Asian woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Sarah Chen from Compassionate Care Services. I'm here to check on how you're doing." She didn't immediately start taking my blood pressure or checking my medications like I expected. Instead, she sat down in my single chair and asked, "How are you feeling today?" And I don't mean just physically. The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me how I was feeling, really feeling, in months. "I'm fine," I said automatically. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "Mrs. Johnson, I've been doing this work for 8 years. I can usually tell when someone says they're fine but doesn't really mean it. You don't have to pretend with me." Something in her voice, gentle but not patronizing, made me want to tell her the truth. But I'd gotten so used to keeping my real feelings to myself. "I suppose I'm a little lonely," I admitted. "That's understandable. Big changes like moving here can be really hard, no matter how necessary they might be." She spent the next hour going through the required medical checks, listening to my lungs, reviewing my medications, taking my vital signs. But she also asked questions that no one else had asked. Questions about my sleep, my appetite, whether I was staying active, whether I felt safe and comfortable. "Your cough sounds much better than what's described in your chart," she said as she packed up her equipment. "Have you been doing anything special for it?" "I've been drinking hot tea with honey," I said. "It's an old remedy my mother taught me." "Smart woman, your mother. Sometimes the old ways work best." Sarah smiled. "I'll be back on Friday to check on you again. Is there anything you need between now and then?" I wanted to say yes, I needed so many things. I needed my independence back, my home back, my sense of self back. But those weren't things Sarah could provide. "I'm fine," I said again, but this time she just nodded without pushing. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's visits became something I looked forward to. She was professional but never cold, thorough but never rushed. More importantly, she talked to me like I was a person with thoughts and feelings, not just a collection of symptoms to be managed. "Tell me about your life before you moved here," she said during her third visit. "What did you enjoy doing?" I found myself talking about my garden, my volunteer work at the library, the little routines that had made me feel useful and connected to the world. Sarah listened without interrupting, asking follow-up questions that showed she was really paying attention. "You sound like you were very independent," she observed. I said, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of pride instead of shame about my past life. "That must make this adjustment especially difficult." I nodded, surprised to feel tears welling up in my eyes. "I feel like I've lost myself." Sarah handed me a tissue without making a big deal of my emotion. "That's a very normal feeling. But the woman you were doesn't just disappear. She's still in there." During her fourth visit, Sarah arrived while Bob was there for his weekly inspection. I watched her take in the dynamic between us, how Bob answered questions directed at me, how he spoke about my condition, like I wasn't in the room, how he dominated the conversation. "Mrs. Johnson?" Sarah said after Bob finished explaining my various limitations. "How would you describe your energy level this week?" I started to answer, but Bob jumped in. She's been tired. All this cold weather affects her arthritis, and she's not as young as she used to be. Sarah kept her eyes on me. Mrs. Johnson. Actually, I said, finding my voice. I've been feeling stronger lately. The cough is almost gone, and my arthritis hasn't been bothering me much. Bob looked annoyed. She doesn't always remember how she's been feeling day to day. Sarah's expression didn't change, but I caught something in her eyes, a flicker of concern that had nothing to do with my cough. After Bob left, Sarah lingered longer than usual. Mrs. Johnson, can I ask you something? Do you feel like you have a voice in decisions about your care and your living situation? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that I didn't have a practiced, non-answer ready. What do you mean? I mean, when decisions are made about your health, your finances, where you live, how you spend your time, do you feel like your opinions matter? I stared at her, feeling something shift inside my chest. No one had ever asked me that before. No one had ever suggested that my opinions should matter. My brothers handle those things, I said carefully. They're very capable. I'm sure they are. But you're also very capable, Mrs. Johnson. I can tell that just from talking with you. You're articulate, you remember details, you have good judgment. Why shouldn't you be involved in decisions about your own life? That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's question. Why shouldn't I be involved in decisions about my own life? When had I stopped being a person with rights and preferences and started being a problem to be managed? During Sarah's next visit, she brought something unexpected, a small potted plant. I know you mentioned missing your garden, she said, setting a beautiful African violet on my windowsill. I thought you might enjoy taking care of this. I stared at the plant, feeling an emotion I couldn't quite name. When was the last time someone had given me something, just because they thought it would make me happy? That's very kind, I said, touching one of the soft leaves gently. But I'm not supposed to have plants in here. There are rules about what we can keep in our rooms. Did someone tell you specifically that you couldn't have plants? I thought about it. No, but Bob says I shouldn't accumulate things. He says I need to keep my space simple. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Johnson, this is your home. You should be able to have things that make you happy, as long as they're not dangerous or disruptive. That word home hung in the air between us. This sterile little room wasn't my home. My home had been sold and was probably occupied by strangers now. But Sarah said it like she meant it, like she thought I deserved to feel at home wherever I lived. I'd like to keep it, I said quietly. Good. And Mrs. Johnson, if anyone gives you trouble about it, you can tell them your healthcare provider recommended it for your emotional well-being. Which is true. Over the following weeks, caring for that little plant became the highlight of my days. I watered it carefully, turned it toward the light, talked to it sometimes when I felt particularly lonely. It was such a small thing, but it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. More importantly, it reminded me that I was still capable of nurturing something, of keeping something alive and healthy. Maybe Bob and Thomas were wrong about me being unable to take care of myself. One afternoon, Sarah arrived to find me sitting by the window with tears on my cheeks. What's wrong? She asked, immediately concerned. My plant, I said, gesturing toward the windowsill, where my African violet sat, drooping and brown around the edges. I think I killed it. Sarah examined the plant carefully. Mrs. Johnson, this plant isn't dead. It's just stressed. See these new leaves starting to grow? This is what plants do when they're adjusting to a new environment. The old leaves die off, but new growth appears. She helped me trim away the dead leaves and adjust the plant's position for better light. Sometimes things have to look worse before they get better. But that doesn't mean they're dying. It might just mean they're getting ready to grow in a new way. As I watched Sarah gently tend to my plant, I realized she might not just be talking about African violets. Maybe she was talking about me too. It was during Sarah's 7th visit that everything began to change. She had been coming to see me for nearly 2 months, and my cough had long since disappeared. But she continued the visits, saying she wanted to monitor my overall health and adjustment to residential living. I looked forward to her visits more than I cared to admit. Sarah treated me like I had a brain, like my thoughts and feelings mattered. She'd ask my opinion about current events, listen to my stories about teaching, and encourage me to talk about Frank and our life together. You light up when you talk about your husband, she observed one afternoon as I shared a memory about Frank's attempts at cooking Sunday breakfast. How long were you married? 43 years. I said, smiling at the memory. He was a terrible cook, but he tried so hard to surprise me on weekends. That sounds like a beautiful marriage. You must miss having someone who knew you so well. I nodded, feeling that familiar ache in my chest. Bob and Thomas say I need to stop living in the past, that I need to focus on my new life here. But sometimes I just want to remember. Sarah's expression grew serious. Mrs. Johnson, There's nothing wrong with treasuring good memories. They're part of who you are. Anyone who tells you to forget your past doesn't understand how healing and important those memories can be. That afternoon, Sarah's visit coincided with one of Bob's unscheduled appearances. I was sitting in my chair by the window, telling Sarah about the herb garden Frank and I had planted in our 3rd year of marriage when Bob knocked and let himself in. "Maggie, we need to talk about." He stopped when he saw Sarah. "Oh, I didn't know you had company. This is Sarah, my healthcare aide," I said. "Sarah, this is my brother Bob." Sarah stood and extended her hand politely. "Nice to meet you. I was just finishing up Mrs. Johnson's weekly check-in." Bob barely shook her hand before turning back to me. "I've been looking at your expenses again, Maggie. This home health thing is costing too much. Your money isn't going to last forever." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. Why was he discussing my finances in front of Sarah? "The visits are medically recommended," Sarah said calmly. "Mrs. Johnson's doctor felt ongoing monitoring would be beneficial. For a cough that's been gone for weeks." Bob's voice carried that edge it got when someone questioned his authority. "Look, I'm sure you're a nice lady, but my sister doesn't need a babysitter. We've been managing her care just fine." "Bob," I said quietly, "Sarah has been very helpful." "Helpful how?" "By encouraging you to keep plants in your room when you know the rules, by filling your head with stories about how things used to be instead of helping you adjust to reality." I looked at Sarah, mortified. How did Bob know about our conversations? "I haven't been filling Mrs. Johnson's head with anything," Sarah said, her voice still calm but with a steel underneath it. "I've been listening to her share memories that are clearly important to her well-being. Her well-being depends on accepting her new circumstances, not dwelling on a past that's over and done with." Sarah's expression didn't change, but I saw her hands tighten slightly around her medical bag. "In my experience, emotional well-being is just as important as physical health. Respecting a patient's autonomy and acknowledging their life experiences are fundamental to good care." "Autonomy." Bob let out a harsh laugh. "She fell down her basement stairs and couldn't get up. She was living alone in a house she couldn't maintain, spending money she didn't have. If that's autonomy, she's better off without it." I watched this exchange, feeling smaller and smaller. They were talking about me like I wasn't there, debating my competence and my needs like I was a child. "Perhaps," Sarah said, "we should ask Mrs. Johnson what she thinks about her own care." Both of them turned to look at me. I felt trapped between them, wanting to disappear. I just want whatever's best," I said weakly. "See," Bob said to Sarah, "she's not equipped to make these decisions anymore. That's why she has family to look out for her." After Bob left, Sarah sat quietly for a long moment. Finally, she said, "Mrs. Johnson, can I ask you something personal?" I nodded, though I felt drained from the confrontation. "Do you feel like your brother respects you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. No one had ever asked me that before. He's trying to take care of me." "That's not what I asked. I asked if you feel respected." I couldn't answer. I couldn't even look at her. "Mrs. Johnson, I've worked with a lot of families over the years. I've seen family members who are genuinely caring and supportive, even when they have to make difficult decisions. And I've seen family members who use their relatives' vulnerability to control them. Bob's not controlling me," I said automatically. "When's the last time you made a decision about your own life? About where you live, how you spend your time, how you spend your money?" I tried to think, but the answer was devastating. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what was best for me. "Mrs. Johnson, how much money do you have?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Bob handles all of that." "Do you get statements, reports, any information about your finances?" I shook my head. "Do you know how much your house sold for?" Another shake of the head. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Johnson, I want to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me. You are a competent adult. You're articulate, you remember things clearly, you have good judgment. The fact that you had one accident doesn't change any of that." "But Bob says." "What Bob says doesn't matter more than what you know about yourself." "Mrs. Johnson, do you feel like you're unable to make decisions?" "No," I said quietly. "I feel like no one wants to hear my decisions." "That's very different, isn't it?" Over the next few visits, Sarah began asking more direct questions. She asked about my daily routine, my financial arrangements, my contact with friends and extended family. The picture that emerged was troubling even to me. I hadn't spoken to any of my old friends in months. Bob had convinced me that they were too busy to be bothered with my problems. I had no access to my own money beyond the $20 a week Bob doled out. I didn't know where my important documents were kept or how my investments were managed. "Mrs. Johnson," Sarah said during one visit, "I'm going to share something with you that might be hard to hear. What you're describing sounds like financial abuse." "Abuse?" The word shocked me. "But Bob is my brother. He's trying to help. Abuse doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like someone taking control of your money and your decisions for your own good. Sometimes it looks like making you feel guilty or incompetent when you try to assert yourself. I thought about all the times Bob had made me feel like a burden, all the times he dismissed my concerns or made me feel stupid for asking questions. But he sold my house to pay for this place. Did he show you how much the house sold for? Did he explain where that money is now? Do you have any say in how it's being spent? The answer to all those questions was no. Mrs. Johnson, I want you to think about something. If Frank were still alive, would he handle your money without telling you anything about it? Would he make major decisions about your life without asking your opinion? The answer came immediately. No. Frank would never do that. We made decisions together. Then why should anyone else get to do it now? That night I lay awake thinking about everything Sarah had said. I thought about the woman I used to be, someone who managed her own household, made her own decisions, stood up for herself when necessary. What had happened to her? I thought about Bob and Thomas and how they'd gradually taken over every aspect of my life. They'd done it slowly, always with reasonable explanations, always claiming it was for my own good. But the result was that I'd become a stranger to myself, someone who needed permission to keep a houseplant, someone who didn't even know how much money she had. Sarah was right. This wasn't help. This was control. And for the first time in 2 years, I started to get angry. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I walked to the front desk and asked to use the phone to call directory assistance. I need the number for Dorothy Winters. I told the operator. Dorothy had been my closest friend at church, someone I'd talked to almost every day before my accident. When Dorothy answered, her voice was surprised and delighted. Maggie! Oh my goodness, I've been so worried about you. I tried calling your house months ago, but the number was disconnected. I didn't know how to reach you. I'm at Sunset Manor now, I said. I'm sorry I haven't called. Things have been complicated. Honey, you don't sound like yourself. Are you okay? It was such a simple question, but nobody had asked me that in so long, and for the first time in 2 years I decided to tell the truth. No, I said. I don't think I am okay. Talking to Dorothy was like opening a window in a stuffy room. For 30 minutes I felt like myself again, not the diminished, dependent version of me that Bob and Thomas had created, but the real Maggie who had opinions and memories and friends who cared about her. Honey, Dorothy said after I'd explained my situation, something doesn't sound right about all this. Frank left you well provided for, didn't he? I remember him talking about how he'd made sure you'd never have to worry about money. What do you mean? That insurance policy he was so proud of, plus the pension investments he made. Frank was always so careful about planning for the future. He used to tell Harold that he wanted to make sure his Maggie could live however she wanted after he was gone. My heart started beating faster. Dorothy, what insurance policy? Bob said Frank's pension ended when he died. There was a long pause. Maggie, Frank had a substantial life insurance policy through the school district, plus that additional policy he bought privately, and his pension had survivor benefits. Didn't you receive any of that? I felt the world tilting around me. I don't know. Bob handles all the financial things. Maggie dear, you need to see those documents yourself. Frank worked too hard and planned too carefully for you to be scraping by on $20 a week. After we hung up, I sat in my chair shaking. Had Bob and Thomas lied to me about my financial situation? Were they keeping money that should have been mine? When Sarah arrived for her next visit, I was still agitated. Mrs. Johnson, you look upset. What's happened? I told her about my conversation with Dorothy, about the insurance policies and pension benefits I'd never heard about. Sarah's expression grew very serious. Mrs. Johnson, I think you need to get copies of your financial documents. You have a right to see them. But Bob says I don't understand financial things. Mrs. Johnson, you managed a household for decades. You balanced budgets, paid bills, made financial decisions. Why would you suddenly be unable to understand money? She was right. Before Frank died, I'd handled our household finances. I'd never been confused or overwhelmed by bank statements or investment reports. When had I accepted Bob's assertion that I was incompetent? How would I get copies of documents? You can start by calling the bank where you used to have accounts. You can contact Frank's former employer about pension benefits. You can call the insurance companies directly. These are your legal rights, Mrs. Johnson. But I don't know which bank or which insurance companies. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Johnson, do you remember where you and Frank kept important documents? Insurance policies, wills, bank information. In the filing cabinet in our bedroom. The top drawer had all our financial papers. Do you know what happened to those papers when your house was sold? I tried to remember. Bob and Thomas had packed everything so quickly, making decisions about what to keep and what to discard. I'd assumed they'd saved the important documents. I think Bob has them. Then you need to ask to see them. They're your documents, Mrs. Johnson. You have every right to examine your own financial records. That afternoon, I called Bob and asked him to come see me. When he arrived, he seemed annoyed. What's so urgent, Maggie? I had to leave work early. I want to see my financial documents, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Bob's expression changed. Why? Is someone putting ideas in your head? I just want to understand my situation better. I've explained your situation. You're on a fixed income, living in an expensive facility, and we need to be careful with money. Bob, I want to see the insurance policies from when Frank died. I want to see bank statements and investment reports. Maggie, those documents are complicated. They're full of legal language and financial terms you wouldn't understand. I'd like to try to understand them. Bob studied my face for a long moment. Has that healthcare worker been filling your head with nonsense? This has nothing to do with Sarah. I want to see my own financial information. Fine, Bob said, his voice clipped. I'll bring some papers next week. But don't blame me when you get confused and overwhelmed. The next week felt like the longest of my life. I kept thinking about what Dorothy had said, about Frank's careful planning and his promises that I'd be taken care of. I thought about the substantial sum Bob had mentioned when my house sold, and how quickly that money seemed to be disappearing. When Bob arrived with a manila folder, Thomas was with him. That should have been my first warning. Here, Bob said, dropping the folder on my small table. These are your financial documents. As you can see, the situation is exactly what I've been telling you. I opened the folder and found bank statements, but they were confusing. The statements were for accounts I'd never heard of, with numbers that seemed lower than I'd expected. There were investment reports that showed declining values and fees that seemed high. This bank statement, I said, pointing to one. I don't recognize this account number. We had to consolidate your accounts for easier management, Thomas explained. It's more efficient this way. And this investment report shows my account losing money every month. The market has been volatile, Bob said impatiently. That's why we're being conservative with your spending. I flipped through more pages looking for the insurance policies Dorothy had mentioned. They weren't there. Where are the life insurance documents from when Frank died? Bob and Thomas exchanged a look. What insurance documents? Dorothy said Frank had substantial life insurance. She said there were school district benefits and a private policy. Maggie, Bob said, his voice taking on that patient tone I'd come to hate. Dorothy is getting old. Her memory isn't what it used to be. Frank had minimal insurance, just enough to cover his funeral expenses. But she was so specific. She's confused? Thomas interrupted. Or maybe she's thinking of someone else's husband. I stared at the papers in front of me, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the numbers and accounts were unfamiliar, and my brother's explanations seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. I'd like to make copies of these documents to study them more carefully, I said. Absolutely not, Bob said, already gathering up the papers. These contain sensitive information. They can't be left lying around. But they're my documents. They're financial documents that need to be kept secure. You don't have a safe place to store them here. After they left, I felt more confused and frustrated than ever. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on what. When Sarah arrived the next day, she found me crying. Mrs. Johnson, what happened? I told her about Bob's visit, about the confusing documents and the missing insurance policies. Mrs. Johnson, I want to ask you something important. Do you remember the name of the bank where you and Frank had your accounts? First National Bank. We banked there for over 20 years. And do you remember Frank's social security number? I nodded. After 43 years of marriage, I knew it by heart. Mrs. Johnson, I think you should call First National Bank directly. You can request information about any accounts that were in your name or Frank's name. But Bob said those accounts were closed and consolidated. Then there should be records of that transfer. Banks keep detailed records, Mrs. Johnson. Money doesn't just disappear without paperwork. That afternoon, with shaking hands, I dialed First National Bank. I'd like to inquire about accounts belonging to Margaret Johnson or Frank Johnson. I told the customer service representative. One moment, please. There was a pause then. Mrs. Johnson, we have several accounts listed under your name. Are you calling about the checking account, the savings account, or the money market account? My heart stopped. I thought those accounts were closed. No, Mom. All 3 accounts are active. In fact, there was a large deposit into your money market account about 18 months ago. Would you like me to mail you current statements? I could barely speak. Yes, please. I'll need to verify your identity first. Can you confirm your social security number and date of birth? After I provided the information, the representative continued. Mrs. Johnson, I should mention that there have been some large withdrawals from your accounts over the past year. If you didn't authorize those transactions, You should come in to speak with a manager. When I hung up the phone, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. Bob and Thomas had been lying to me. My accounts weren't closed. There had been a large deposit, probably from Frank's insurance policies or the house sale, and there had been unauthorized withdrawals. My own brothers had been stealing from me. That evening, when Sarah arrived for what was supposed to be a routine check-in, she found me sitting in the dark. "Mrs. Johnson, are you all right?" I turned on the lamp and showed her the notes I'd taken from my conversation with the bank. "Sarah, I think my brothers have been stealing my money." Sarah sat down across from me, her expression grave. "Tell me everything." As I recounted the phone conversation with the bank, I watched Sarah's face grow increasingly angry. "Mrs. Johnson, this is serious financial abuse. What your brothers have done is not just morally wrong, it's illegal. But they're my family. Family doesn't give anyone the right to steal from you. Mrs. Johnson, you need to take action to protect yourself and your assets." "I don't know how. I don't know what to do." Sarah reached over and took my hand. "You're not alone in this. There are people who can help you. But first, we need to get you those bank statements and find out exactly what's been happening with your money." For the first time in 2 years, I felt a spark of the old Maggie, the woman who didn't back down from a fight, who stood up for what was right. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "Let's find out the truth." The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in 2 years. Sarah had given me the phone number for elder services, and I knew what I had to do. "My name is Margaret Johnson," I told the intake worker, "but I believe my brothers have been financially abusing me." Those words, spoken out loud, to a stranger, felt both terrifying and liberating. I was no longer keeping their secret, no longer protecting them from the consequences of their actions. Within 2 hours, I had an appointment with an elder abuse caseworker named Linda Martinez. Sarah offered to come with me, and I accepted gratefully. I was finding my strength, but I wasn't foolish enough to think I had to do this alone. Linda Martinez was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who listened to my story without judgment or interruption. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked me directly in the eyes. "Mrs. Johnson, what you've described is textbook financial exploitation of an elderly person. It's a felony in this state. Are you prepared to press charges against your brothers?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Press charges against Bob and Thomas? I don't know. They're my family. "Mrs. Johnson," Linda said gently, "family members who steal from you, isolate you from your friends, and make you believe you're incompetent aren't acting like family. They're acting like criminals." Sarah squeezed my hand. "Whatever you decide, we'll support you. But you deserve to have your money back and your life back." That afternoon, Linda accompanied me to First National Bank. What we discovered there was worse than I'd imagined. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, pulled up my account history on his computer. "Mrs. Johnson, 18 months ago, there was a deposit of $247,000 into your money market account. This appears to be from a house sale and insurance proceeds. $250,000. Frank had provided for me better than I'd ever dreamed. Since then," Mr. Peterson continued, "there have been monthly withdrawals ranging from $3,000 to $8,000. The current balance in all your accounts combined is $89,000. I felt sick. In 18 months, Bob and Thomas had stolen over $150,000 from me." "Who authorized these withdrawals?" Linda asked. "They were made by Robert Johnson, who was listed as a joint account holder and power of attorney." "I never signed any power of attorney papers," I said. Peterson frowned and pulled up more documents on his screen. "The power of attorney was filed 6 months after the large deposit. The signature appears to be yours." He showed me the document on his computer screen. It was my signature, but I had no memory of signing it. "Mrs. Johnson," Linda said quietly, "do you remember ever signing legal documents that your brothers brought you? Maybe they told you it was for something else." I thought back to all those folders full of papers Bob had brought me over the months, all those times he'd said, "Just sign here. Maggie, it's just paperwork for the facility." "I think they tricked me into signing it," I whispered. Linda's expression hardened. "That's fraud, Mrs. Johnson. Obtaining power of attorney through deception is a serious crime, a mystery." Peterson immediately froze all withdrawals from my accounts and removed Bob's access. "Mrs. Johnson, you'll need to come in tomorrow to sign new signature cards and establish your sole control over these accounts." Walking out of that bank, I felt like a different person than the one who'd walked in. I wasn't poor. I wasn't a burden. I had been systematically robbed by the people who were supposed to protect me. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in years: powerful. Linda helped me understand my options. I could file criminal charges, pursue civil recovery of the stolen money, and take immediate steps to regain control of my life. It wouldn't be easy, and it would mean confronting Bob and Thomas directly. "I'm scared," I admitted to Sarah that evening. "What if they retaliate? What if they try to have me declared incompetent or something?" Mrs. Johnson. Sarah said firmly, "You've been assessed by multiple healthcare professionals. You're clearly competent. You're articulate, you remember details, you make rational decisions. No judge would declare you incompetent based on your actual condition. But what if? What if you spend the rest of your life letting fear control you? What if you let them keep stealing from you? What if other elderly people suffer because these men face no consequences?" That last point hit me hard. How many other families had Bob convinced that their elderly relatives were burdens? How many other people were suffering in silence like I had? The next morning, I called Bob and asked him to come see me immediately. "What's wrong now?" he asked, clearly annoyed. "We need to talk. Bring Thomas." When they arrived an hour later, I was ready. Sarah had offered to be there for moral support, but I declined. This was something I needed to do myself. "Sit down," I said, my voice calmer than I'd expected. "Maggie, what's this about? You sounded strange on the phone." "I know about the money," I said simply. The change in both their faces was immediate and telling. Bob tried to bluster. "What money? Maggie, you're not making sense. I went to First National Bank yesterday. I know about the 247,000 from Frank's insurance and the house sale. I know you've been stealing from me for over a year." Thomas went pale. Bob's face turned red. "Stealing," Bob said. "We've been managing your money responsibly." "Do you have any idea how expensive this place is? How much your medical care costs?" "This place costs $200 a month," I said. I'd done my homework. "My medical care costs about $400 a month. You've been taking between $3,000 and $8,000 every month. Where did that extra money go, Bob?" "Administrative costs, investment fees, unexpected expenses." "Lies," I said, standing up. "All lies. You made me believe I was poor while you were stealing my money. You made me feel like a burden while living off what Frank left for me." "Maggie, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. I understand that you saw Frank's death and my accident as an opportunity. I understand that you isolated me from my friends so no one would ask questions. I understand that you convinced me I was incompetent so I wouldn't ask to see financial statements." Thomas finally spoke, his voice shaky. "Maggie, we never meant for it to go this far. We thought you wouldn't need all that money anyway. So you decided to help yourselves to it." Bob's mask finally slipped completely. "You're damn right we did. Do you know what we've had to deal with? The constant worry, the phone calls, the responsibility. We deserve compensation for managing your mess of a life." My mess of a life. I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd experienced in years. "Bob, I lived independently for 8 years after Frank died. I managed my own finances, maintained my own home, volunteered in my community. The only mess in my life has been letting you convince me I was helpless." "You fell down your own stairs? Once?" "I had one accident, and you used it to steal my life and my money." I walked to my small table and picked up the papers Linda had helped me prepare. "These are criminal complaint forms," I said. "Linda Martinez from Elder Services helped me fill them out. Financial exploitation of an elderly person is a felony. You could both go to prison." Bob lunged forward, but I stepped back. "You can't do this to us. We're family. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't lie and manipulate and isolate. You stopped being my family the day you decided I was worth more to you as a victim than as a sister." Thomas was crying now. "Maggie, please. I have a wife, kids. If I go to prison, you should have thought of that before you stole from me." "What do you want?" Bob asked, his voice defeated. "I want every penny back with interest. I want my legal documents back. I want you both out of my life, and I want you to understand that if you ever try to contact me or intimidate me or interfere with my life in any way, I will file these criminal charges immediately." "And if we pay you back?" Thomas asked hopefully. "Then I'll consider keeping this a civil matter instead of a criminal one. But Bob will never have access to my accounts again, and neither of you will ever make decisions about my life again." After they left, shaken, angry, but clearly understanding that their game was over, I sat in my chair and felt something I hadn't felt since before Frank died. I felt like myself. 3 weeks later, I moved out of Sunset Manor. Not because anyone forced me to, but because I chose to. With my finances back under my control, I had options. Real options. I chose a beautiful senior community called Garden Heights, where I had my own 2-bedroom apartment with a full kitchen and a balcony garden, where I could have guests and cook my own meals and come and go as I pleased. Sarah helped me move even though she was no longer my healthcare provider. "I'm proud of you," she said as we arranged my African violet, now thriving on my new kitchen windowsill. "You found your strength when you needed it most." "I had help," I said. "I had someone who saw me as a person instead of a problem." Bob and Thomas repaid most of the money they'd stolen, though it took several months and the threat of criminal charges. They also faced civil penalties and had to pay damages. More importantly, they faced consequences for their actions. I never spoke to them again. Some people might think that's harsh, But I learned something important through all of this. Forgiveness doesn't require putting yourself back in a position to be victimized again. 6 months after leaving Sunset Manor, I was asked to speak at a community education event about elder abuse. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of seniors and their families, I felt a profound sense of purpose. Elder abuse often doesn't look like what you might expect, I told them. It doesn't always involve strangers or obvious criminals. Sometimes it's committed by people who claim to love you, people who convince you they're helping while they're actually harming you. After my presentation, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My daughter has been managing my finances since my husband died," she said quietly. "She keeps telling me I don't have enough money for the things I want to do, but I used to have substantial savings." After hearing your story, I'm wondering. I gave her Linda Martinez's phone number. "You have the right to see your own financial documents," I told her. "You have the right to ask questions. You have the right to live your life on your terms." 3 months later, she called to tell me that her daughter had been stealing from her too, and that she was taking steps to protect herself and recover her money. That's when I truly understood that my suffering hadn't been meaningless. By finding my voice and standing up for myself, I'd also found my purpose helping other people recognize their own worth and their own power. Today I'm 74 years old. I live in my own apartment, manage my own money, and make my own decisions. I have friends, hobbies, and a life that belongs to me. I garden on my balcony, volunteer with elder abuse prevention programs, and sometimes have dinner with Sarah, who has become one of my dearest friends. My African violet sits on my kitchen windowsill, full and blooming, its leaves a vibrant green. Like me, it survived being transplanted. Like me, it learned to thrive in a new environment. Sometimes people ask me if I'm angry about the 2 years I lost, the money that was stolen, the dignity that was stripped away. Yes, I'm angry. But I'm also grateful. I'm grateful because I learned that strength doesn't disappear with age. Sometimes it just goes into hiding and needs the right person to help you find it again. I'm grateful because I learned that being alone is better than being with people who don't value you. Most of all, I'm grateful because I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to stand up for yourself, to refuse to be treated as less than you are. My brothers thought they knew what was best for me. They thought they could manage me like a problem to be solved. But fate had another plan. Fate sent me Sarah, who saw me as a person worth fighting for. Fate gave me the courage to fight back, and fate reminded me that I had never actually lost my power, I had only forgotten how to use it. I'm Margaret Johnson. I'm 74 years old, and I'm nobody's burden. I'm just a woman who learned to bloom again.